All right, guys. So we want to welcome you to our fourth episode. Right?
I think it's the third. I thought
fourth. No, we've done three.
There was the one,
Ben and Katie.
just you, the one with me.
Just me.
Four.
Yep.
Four.
So this is
Shows
fourth.
how many of them you've watched.
Yes. So we have a new guest with us. What's your
Hello,
name?
I'm Aaron. I hope you
Nice.
know me. I know you.
Danny. What's your name?
Oh yeah, Danny. Somehow I'm back here again.
Yep. We roped him in for another episode here. But today I want to talk to the bros here about dependence on God and what that looks like. I know with a lot of us, when things that we were depending on before get removed or switched or changed or modified or whatever, it exposes where we were leaning maybe a little heavy on some stuff before, or I don't know. So sometimes we can see that in our habits. If a habit gets switched up, sometimes we can see that in a activity or something that we really enjoy doing. All of a sudden gets kind of shifted or anything like that. What are we depending on? For me, it's easy to see like a picture of dependence because I have kids. So I realize like even tax-wise, I have dependence. And so what that looks like is basically they are not able to go out and provide for themselves in, financially, or some of them I'm sure they could survive a little bit on on the land and scavenge and whatever, but they depend on me to go to the store, get food, bring it home,
Right.
or make money, go to the store, get food, come home, kind of thing. So when we then examine with our own lives of like how do we depend on God and what does that look like, I'm curious what you guys, how you guys are aware of that, or maybe even in this season how your awareness of that has been heightened, of how much you depend on God, and what do you depend on God for.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think it's interesting in that pretty much, especially in America specifically, you are the first thing you're taught, basically, at least from a worldly perspective, once you're old enough to start considering those things, is you need to go to school, get a good job, so you can pay for this, so you can raise your family, so it's very you-based. You're indoctrinated into believing, or at least you're fed the fact that, like, even as a Christian, it's like it's just common sense. You have to do this so you can get a good job, so you can make a good amount of money. And we're basically taught to not rely on God. And in America, we are taught to not rely on God. And so I think overcoming that is, it's difficult. And I think especially in America, it brings up that whole conversation of, well, what does that look like here? Because does it differ due to just pure monetary circumstances, like we are in America? Because some people, there are people that have said, like, well, technically, we should be living off the land like John the Baptist and sleeping on the highway.
Crickets.
Yeah, and I'm like, I guess. And so that's an interesting conversation in itself. But I know kind of the basis for me has been, am I getting stressed out to the point where I'm like, everything revolves around this? Because otherwise it will become an idol very quickly. Your stress will become an idol. And that's what I've found. And so, especially in this time, it's like, when like the store I worked at was closed and everything, I'm like, I'm getting stressed here, real quick. And this stand sucks. No, but what happened is I had to check myself. I'm like, okay, if this is all I can think about, like what are my options? What am I going to do? And it's like, the thing is, I don't even have I have very few expenses. I'm in such a good place compared to a lot of people that have lost their jobs, but yet I was still stressed out. And so, I think making sure that's not what's consuming you. If that's what you think about for me when you wake up, I'm like, this is a problem, and I need to check my faith, because that's what it comes down to is your faith. So in this time, I think it's really imperative more than ever to be checking your faith constantly, to be in the Word constantly, reinforcing your faith.
So what do you depend on God for?
I mean,
Like where if he doesn't show up, you don't got it.
right now it's I guess in a lot of ways financially, and that not even just for me. Like I said, that's
Yeah.
pretty taken care of. Like I'll be fine. It's not that. Like I'm in a place in my life where that's not a huge deal. It's my dad. He still has a job, thankfully. But if that was to go away, like what do I do? We have to be relying on something greater, because right now, if you don't have a job and you're trying to get one, it is very difficult.
Yep.
So I think that's the biggest one, because we don't have a huge barrier, like, at all. So if he was to lose his job, our family would be in trouble quickly. So I think that's a big one.
I think a lot of what I've like looked into, what I felt was like, in a lot of situations, it's like natural to go, oh, well, what can I do with my situations? And then a lot more recently, they've been having to go with, well, what can God do with my situations? Because there's nothing I can do anymore. Like, this is a natural disaster, so to speak. And I'm like, there's nothing I can do to control about it. So I just need to sit back and ask God what he can do and ask him to move in the situations.
Yeah. I was kind of looking through some verses and stuff that had that similar kind of language. There's one that'll kind of stir the pot a little bit here. Psalm 62:7. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock and my refuge. What do you think about that?
I got to think about that.
Yeah. The salvation piece, the honor piece, depending on God. I think recognizing that he is stable, unchanging, true, good, all that kind of stuff. And then, the refuge piece of it too, of when we're in trouble or when we're having issues. This last week I've had a lot more time to listen to the word because of the nature of what I've been doing for work, and been listening through 1st, 2nd Kings, and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and it's been fascinating to read about and see these kings and stuff that didn't depend on God.
Yeah.
Some of them did. Some of them started out in a really good spot, and then some of them just were like, nope, I'm going to depend on an Asherah pole or the local gods or all these things. And it's like, okay, we see a lot of this same stuff, the idols and that kind of stuff in today's society. But they're not as mystical looking. Yeah. Some of them. Right. I mean, I've talked about this a lot, the phones, we've got entertainment, we've got all this stuff. And there's a lot of people that have even been jumping on with the whole Corona craze thing of like, man, all the American idols are just like shut down. And I do think there's some credence to that. Like, I think, wow, that is powerful. Where I'm hoping we can kind of focus on tonight is just like where and how do we depend on God in the situation? So when everything else all the other options get removed from the table, I think that's kind of what dependence looks like in a way too, of like, okay, if I'm truly depending on God, I'm not looking for any other plan B or other options. It's like, nope, I need God to show up here. This is where I'm leaning on God for, and also being aware, like, okay, if God doesn't show up in this situation, I don't have anything.
Yep.
I can't ride this through on my personality or on my own discipline or on my own whatever. And that's where I'm finding myself with a lot of this is like, man, I have to depend on God, because for a long time I'm realizing too, I depended a lot on people. Like being an extrovert, being a people person, I recharge around people. Yeah. And so when people get removed
when there's no
and
more
I'm not able to do it,
people.
I'm like, yikes, okay. But it shifts my focus then back to on God, where it should be in the first place, to where it's like, okay, hanging out with people can come out of the overflow of my dependence on God and not be based out of that.
I think a lot of dependence could be, if I take away everything but this one thing that I'm depending on, I'm still okay. So like if you've got your phone as an idol and you lose everything but your phone, you're not going to be okay. There's a lot of things you can't do. But if God's what you're depending on, and you lose everything besides God, you can still you can survive off of God, and you can really thrive off of God too. So it's like, it's that whole, once I lose everything else and I'm left with just the thing I'm depending on, is that the right thing to be left depending on?
Yeah.
Right. I see what you're saying. It's like to tell truly what you should be depending on and ultimately what you're actually dependent on, like the thing that you can have nothing else and have that. Yeah. And you were talking about, Josh, how you were saying kind of being forced almost into it. And I think it's interesting. People right now, a big thing you'll hear is like, if you lost your job, now is the perfect time to maybe embrace that dream you had or whatever, like go after that, right? But in the same way, it's like this might be the perfect time to really get in with God and understand, am I truly dependent on him? Like you might be forced into that situation to where now you have to be, or like you said, you either got it or you don't.
Yeah. And it's funny how quickly God pulls through. This last Wednesday, I was low. I was sitting right over there, and I was just like, man, I don't like this. And one of the things I've realized throughout my life, there have been several situations that this has happened where when I don't have any sort of control, input, or whatever with the outcome or what's going on, it can really stress me out. Where it's like, okay, man. But even in those moments, I do have one thing that I can do. I can depend on God, and I can, in depending on God, I'm trusting him with the outcome. And knowing that there's nothing I can do other than trust him that will help. There's nothing I can do in this situation with what we're going through socially and the limits and everything like that. I can't do anything to change that other than put my hope in God, to put my trust in God, to realize like, okay, I depend on him for a lot, and to really lean on him and to not stop leaning on him once all this stuff goes back to normal. Because that can also be the struggle there too. Is okay, once I get what I want, okay, now I'm good. Now I can go back to doing everything.
I'll catch you later. I'll call you when I need you.
Yeah. Yep. In Colossians, it talks about here too, where see to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and elemental spiritual forces of this world, rather than on Christ. And so when we try to, or we allow things in that isn't solely dependent on Christ, him crucified and raised from the dead, that is where we get into big trouble. And it sounds like uber simple or whatever. But as you start unpacking certain things, you start wondering, man, why am I so frustrated? Why am I this? Why am I that? It's like, well, because I'm depending on other things. And if I'm depending on, eating at my favorite restaurant or getting my favorite drink or, whatever, and then all of a sudden that's gone, now I get real moody and really upset. Versus if I'm depending on God and his mercies every morning, man, I wake up, I open up the Bible, boom. Joy.
I think it's really important too to look for the things that you're depending on, because like you can be, I need to depend on God and nothing else, right? But like if you don't intentionally go, yes, I need to depend on God, but what are the things I'm depending on right now? You can be like, okay, well, I'm still in a bad mood. What's up? Well, it's because you may be depending on God more, but you're just like still depending on that social interaction with a friend, right? I'm like, I can't hang out with people. This sucks. I'm still depending on God though, but like you haven't looked into yourself to realize, oh no, you actually are still putting way too much priority on that time with friends.
Yeah. So you're saying it's very possible to be kind of codependent on a group of things, and it's not only important to identify what the key thing you should be dependent on, but then also what may be feeding into that.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
And then even just unpacking, just so we can kind of get some visual stuff. Like, what's one of the first things you depend on when you wake up in the morning?
Breakfast.
Yeah. Right. But you usually make your own breakfast, right? Because it's very specific. If you want to know what Danny eats for breakfast, check out episode 3. He shares with us a little bit of his routine there. His daily dietary
needs. You want
needs,
abs like
like
I need to watch
Jonathan.
that episode again.
What's something else? Say you're going to work. How do you get to work?
Car.
Right? So you hop in your car, and what do you use? You depend on your car being
oil, everything.
There's so many things that and the list just kind of adds up after a certain point. It's like, okay, wow, I depend on a lot of
and I think it's interesting when you really think about it. Like you were saying, if you actually looked at just from the point you get out of bed to going to work, coming home from work, like that part of your day, the amount of things that you're just kind of subconsciously counting on working is huge.
Like your lungs.
No, exactly. It's so much greater than just what you eat and what's, your car and traffic and all this, it's also your own body. Like, yeah.
Yep. So what are a few things that you depend on?
I think I was first like, what do I depend on? First thing I thought was, well, money, because I can't survive without money. It's a real world out there, but it's like one of that times where you realize, like, well, if whatever the first thing you think of is, if it's not God, you should probably put less priority on it. So right, like, I was thinking money because got to pay for all those things. You got to pay for the gas, you got to pay for the oil, but then it's just like all those different like factors, like obviously car to get to work. I need internet so I can do X, Y, and Z, get to work, so I can look into my work for the day and things like that. But like there's a lot of things that once you start looking into it, you're like, wow, there's a lot of things I depend on I didn't even realize.
Well, and then some of the stuff that we've unpacked in the last couple episodes is when we really, really depend on God first and foremost in our life, there's so many other things, and we'll continue to talk about things after this too. But the dependence on God piece is when you depend on God and you trust him, all these other things that look difficult on the front end, that you talk about tithing, or you talk about prayer, or you talk about worship, or you talk about, holy living, or, whatever, like all of these things, you start to describe them, and you read through the Bible and you see this, it's like, man, that's really difficult. Well, it's difficult if you're depending on yourself. Yep. It's difficult and near impossible in some of these situations if you're trying to do it on your own. It's when we're depending on God and allowing him to fill us up with his Spirit and allowing him to work through us and leaning into that, that's where a lot of this stuff becomes possible. And it actually grows something in us too. So
yeah, I've heard it compared to like, so if you've ever had a big hit of adrenaline, it's in a way it's kind of like that. Like when you get hit with that adrenaline, you start doing things you didn't know your body was capable of. You're running faster, you're jumping over stuff stuff you would never do, and your body is in a complete just escape mode basically. And in a similar way, we see stories of people that like their husband was murdered and they end up going and like loving on the people that did that in the end. And it's like I think about that in my mind sometimes, because we were talking about this actually in class the other day, and I was like, yeah, there's no way I could do that. And they're like, yeah, there's no way you could. You can, because that's not, like, we can't. Our sinful nature doesn't allow it. Yeah. But if we're now reliant on something other than ourselves to overcome that, it becomes a possibility.
Yeah. Yep.
It's like asking God to give you the strength to do different things, and a lot of times it takes a lot of strength in itself to be willing to ask God, because like if you don't have a heart to even want to consider forgiving someone, it takes a lot of strength to ask God to give you the heart to forgive someone.
Right. It's like we call those dangerous prayers when you're like, God, whatever is, sometimes it's like whatever's hindering me from knowing you, take that out, and it's like you better be ready, because
So I mean, this whole season, God's been giving me a lot of perspective and encouraging me with some things. And like I said, kind of even in that moment where I was really down, he showed up. I was just like, God, I don't know what I'm going to do. Like, help me out here. And he did, like within minutes. That's the thing, where there wasn't this delay. And even in the stories of the Old Testament kings and everything like that, like God wasn't like he honored the people's depending on him. And I think the other verse that comes to mind regarding, and we kind of talked about this a little bit in the beginning, of dependence and faith and that kind of thing, is the verse in Hebrews 11:1. And it says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance of what we do not see. And I think that's another beautiful picture of what dependence can look like too, where when we really buy into Jesus loves me, he died for me, he's living, and the Holy Spirit wants to come and reside in my life and equip me and do all that stuff. There's a lot of really, really cool stuff then that we're unlocked into, that we're equipped and empowered by him to do, that we wouldn't normally be able to do, that we wouldn't normally be set up to naturally achieve. But through one act of dependence, through one act of acknowledging, like, okay, I'm leaning into you on this. This doesn't make sense. I need something that is beyond my understanding. Because right now, and like you were saying, even with your example, something really bad or traumatic happens to you, your natural instincts kick in. You're like, well, I'm going to self-preserve. I'm going to self-protect. I'm going to, you stay away from my heart here. But when God comes in and shows up, there's things, and when he has access to things, when he has access to our tithe, to our time, to our habits, all these things. Quick recap, right? There's so much that he can do and wants to do in that and through that. Yeah. That's awesome. But it starts from being dependent on him.
Yeah. A lot of stuff that if you're not willing to be dependent on, you'll never know is even there. Like all the potential things you could do in your life if you're dependent, but you kind of want to depend on your phone instead, and you're never going to know unless you actually like give it a shot, you know?
Well, and the fun thing too, I'm sure some of you guys have probably got this, and some of you guys watching this have probably already got this, but it's fascinating. It was fascinating to me when I moved out of my parents' house, and I realized, whoa, there's a lot of things I was depending on that aren't there anymore.
Why isn't my laundry getting
exactly clean? So you remove yourself from a spot of dependence, and you realize, whoa, okay, I was really leaning pretty heavy on that. It's another, kind of the opposite picture with God of realizing like, okay, I want to be aware of the things and the areas where I need to depend on God and lean in with him for that. But it's also fascinating when you see in your day-to-day life things and people, situations, objects, all that kind of stuff that we assume are going to work or we assume are going to be there, and we depend on those things working. If they don't work, we can start getting kind of frustrated, So, but you guys have anything else you want to add?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
When I go in a British accent whenever I say
not necessarily, sir.
All right, guys. So the encouragement for you guys this week is to just really depend on God. I know some of you guys are already depending on God, and there's some things that we're depending on God to show up in. If he doesn't, then we'll continue to wait. But just to be in that dependent state of where there's things that God's called us to, there's things that God's called us to do, and those things we do need to activate and be proactive with. But then there's other things where we do actually need to wait and lay it before his feet and be like, hey, this is yours, and you're responsible for the results. So I'm not going to try to force something to happen or be too quick to like, well, he wasn't acting quick enough, so I'm going to do it myself. That's where a lot of us can get in trouble.
God, I gave you some time.
God, I give you 5 minutes, and he was going to do it in 7, right? But so we love you guys. Thank you guys for tuning in this week, and we'll see you next week.
That's the plan.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
We need a button that we can click that's like, stop recording.